Vargum looked upon the rising dead. Graves could no longer be dug quick enough to lay the casualties of war to rest. The rot of days-old corpses filled Vargum's nostrils as he helplessly marched along the lines where fresh bodies were still being piled up. The burden weighed heavily upon his shoulders. It was he who led them, and it was he who had failed them. How many more could they lose before they were completely overrun? How many more before the rest began to abandon their posts? The city of Phalantia was already lost, and Vargum's forces had already been pushed back west to the Barren Isle, which many of the soldiers had started calling the Sanguine Isle. Vargum thought the joke inappropriate, if indeed it was a joke. However, the amount of blood that the isle had seen, he could not deny it was a fitting name. As he walked, Vargum watched his soldiers, the fear in their eyes, where pride and ferocity once gleamed. They were the last defense before the Leonian capital of Nel Faldur, his homeland, his people's homeland. Yet with every passing day, more and more would never again look upon it. Vargum ran his fingers through his mane, stroking down the braids he'd earned through the years. Captain, Bloodlord, Warlord, each marked success on the battlefield, yet he would not find victory here, not if things continued the way they were. His muzzle twitched disgustedly as he passed a particularly nasty cadaver which was swarming with flies. They had received no reinforcements from the city of Dagron, and troops from the Idward lords would not arrive for a few more days. Vargum continued on under the scorching Escherine sun, which did nothing for the smell. Across the way, Vargum watched as more troops were being outfitted, if you could call them troops. Farmers, hunters, smiths, and more. For most, it was their first time holding a weapon, and while a hunter may know their way around a bow or a blade, the game in Escherine generally did not fight back, nor were they backed up by 1,000 more, eager for vengeance. Morale was low, and more than once, Vargum had heard whispers of mass desertion. Could he blame them? He had never faced odds this bleak, and there were no motivational words or gestures that could come across as anything more than an insult to his people. Vargum made his way to the command tent. His legs were heavy, trembling with each step. His armor was little more than torn leather and buckled plate now, and while he had returned from each skirmish with his life, there were pieces of him that had been claimed by the enemy. Half of his right ear was the most plain to see, though it gave him little discomfort. As he approached the command tent, a Leonian scout exited, bowing to the Warlord before taking his leave. The scout was small for a Leonian male, barely 6 foot tall, and his mane was short and only boasted a couple of braids. However, his coat was sandy gold, as opposed to Vargum's own red-tinged coat, which gave him pause for thought as he entered the tent.
"Who was our little friend?"
Vargum asked, his voice weary and labored.
"Does he come with some good news?"
He sat down, his gaze not even reaching that of his captain, who already wore an expression of disappointment as he half-heartedly handed a piece of parchment to his warlord.
"Chief Akira will not be sending reinforcements,"
the captain murmured through a clenched jaw. Vargum lowered his head, his scarlet mane gently brushing the battle map.
"His tribes are also losing heavy numbers in the south, though he and King Yarlin have managed to hold the east bank of the River Nel,"
he continued with a sigh.
Have we heard anything from the Snowcoat tribes in the north?
Vargum pleaded, hoping for something.
We've heard nothing since the fall of Philantia. Gods be merciful. They should be defending from the fortress of Maldur.
The captain replied, with no attempt to conceal the pain and doubt in his voice. A growl filled the tent as Vargum grasped one of the pieces that represented his army.
Every day, hundreds of our people fall. Do you really think the gods are capable of mercy?
Vargum scoffed as he crushed the piece in his fist, sending its dust scattering across the table.
Tell me, Gesius, where are the gods? Where is their mercy?
Vargum snarled, his head turning to his captain, venom burning in his torch-illuminated eyes. Gesius flinched at the sight, his body beginning to tremble.
Apologies, Warlord. It was just a turn of phrase. I meant nothing by it.
Gesius replied, bowing low. But Vargum simply growled again, staring back at the table, scratching at the scabbing on his torn ear. His lord now calmed, Gesius sought to praise him, hoping some words of encouragement would help.
With your leadership, I'm sure we will weather this storm. Even as we speak, new soldiers are being trained for...
Not another word was uttered before Vargum's fist cracked through the table.
Those soldiers are farmers!
Vargum bellowed, launching the table across the tent and turning to Gesius with an inferno blazing in his eyes.
We're putting weapons in their hands, only to send them to their deaths!
Vargum's amber eyes, framed by his crimson mane, were a truly terrifying sight when the Warlord was angry.
But Warlord, the Iduard reinforcements will be here soon, and surely the war chief will bring more troops.
Gesius countered, whilst hiding behind his trembling hands. All the while Vargum's large, muscular frame quivered and twitched, his hand grasping the hilt of his khopesh.
Those reinforcements won't be here for another 3 days.
Vargum growled through clenched teeth.
And the war chief has been holed up in Nel Faldur for 2 months. How many more of our people have to join the dead before you admit that he has forsaken us?
As he continued, the rage left his body, and nothing but a defeated Leonian stood before Gesius.
No, my friend. We fight alone.
Vargum turned from Gesius, his head lowering to mask the tears that welled in his eyes.
Leave me,
he said, dismissively waving his captain out of the tent, who was quick to oblige. Vargum looked at the state of his tent, silently sobbing at the situation he'd been put in. He could hear the guards outside chattering, knowing that they'd heard everything. One seemed to find Gesius's exit amusing, whilst the other confirmed the whispers of a possible desertion. Vargum knew he was losing everything he'd fought so hard for. If they stayed, his people would die. If they fled, they would be exiled for cowardice. He closed his eyes, and thoughts of home flooded his mind. The gates of Nel Faldur opened before him, and the vibrant colours of the city filled his vision. The scent of spices and sizzling meats from the marketplace filled his nostrils, and the welcoming sound of victory horns filled his ears. His eyes opened, and the knowledge that they could not achieve victory was all that was left in his mind. But pride and honour was the Leonian way, and the only way to retain both was to press on regardless. Vargum knew what he had to do. One by one, Vargum loosened his braids, shedding decades of accolades in a matter of seconds. With this single act, he was no longer a warlord, or even a captain. He was simply a soldier. The hours passed, and night was settling. The final rays of the sun licked at the gentle pinks and purples of the evening light, as it disappeared behind the horizon. Vargum had not eaten, nor was it food that he craved. His evening had been spent cleaning his armor and sharpening his blades. 2 Kopesh swords hung at his waist, as fine as the day they were crafted. Still in his hands was a glaive, which he was still sharpening. The sparks of stone across steel lit up the engravings along the blade, the symbols of an ancient Leonian dialect not even known by Vargum. The flap of the tent shifted, and Gesius gingerly stepped in. A single torch illuminated the tent, its light enveloping Vargum's silhouette, his back facing his second-in-command. His ears pricked back at the sound of company, but he did not turn as the sparks continued to fly. His movement was slow, deliberate, even threatening, and Gesius felt uncomfortable.
Warlord, our scouts report movement on the enemy lines. It could be nothing, but there's a chance they could be attempting a night raid.
Gesius waited for an answer, but the moments ticked by with no response.
My lord, what would you have me do?
Gesius asked, clearly growing restless. The grinding stopped, and Vargum stood to full height, his form large and frightening.
I am no longer your warlord,
Vargum replied, turning to his captain, where a look of shock took Gesius's face as he laid eyes upon the shaggy crimson mane that now hung freely.
You now hold the highest command in our forces. Lead them in whatever way you see fit. But I will die as our brothers and sisters have died.
And with that, Vargum exited the tent, leaving a bemused Gesius in his wake. The night air was cool, and the flame of Vargum's torch gently waved in the breeze as he made his way out of the camp and onto the narrow bridge that connected the island to the eastern bank. The night masked the enemy, the darkness a shroud. Even the flames in the distance did little to illuminate their camps and, more importantly, their numbers. Behind Vargum stood the palisade gatehouse, which boasted but 2 guards who looked out confusedly at their warlord, who waved his torch in the darkness like a signal. But all intentions were made clear when, out of the vast blackness of the night, the thudding of hooves gave way to the visage of the enemy, the centaurs of the amber wastes. 6 came forward, but Vargum suspected that there were many more lurking in the dark. The centaurs said nothing, as they gazed upon the lone soldier who, without his braids, was not even worth addressing.
I am Vargum, former warlord of Nel Faldur. I challenge your greatest warrior for the right to claim this isle.
Vargum stated proudly, thrusting the butt of his glaive into the sand as if it were a war banner. The centaur party said nothing, only grunting before leaving. Vargum assumed as much, for the centaurs did not value honorable combat, at least not while they were winning. Regardless, Vargum knew what would come next, and he prepared himself, placing his torch in a sconce beside him before pulling his glaive out of the ground and lowering himself into battle stance. He closed his eyes and let the cool night breeze run through his flowing mane, his muscular form loosening as he proudly accepted his fate. The beating of hooves began again, closer, closer, more this time. He wondered if they had truly sent out a sizable force for a single target, and, if so, he felt honored. The first of his assailants galloped out of the dark at him, with a spear in his hand, but Vargum was too quick, dropping down under the strike and slicing across his front legs, sending him into the river. The second was already upon him, but Vargum's glaive whirled around the weapon before finding his place in the Centaur's chest. A third was on the way, but the first was now trying to climb out of the river. With blinding speed, Vargum plunged his glaive into the struggling Centaur before whipping it around in an arc, sending blood splattering across his assailant's face. Unable to see, the third was quickly dispatched with a blade across the throat.
I am Vargum, former warlord of Nel Faldur. On my honor, I will defend this isle to my dying breath.
He bellowed into the night as more enemies charged out of the darkness. Gesius now stood atop the palisade battlements, along with a host of confused Leonians, as they watched their warlord fighting alone. Upon the narrow bridge, the Centaurs could not utilize their numbers against the lone warrior and, one by one, they fell, each kill avenging one of his own fallen. At least 10 lay dead before him, and he knew it wouldn't be long before they resorted to a steady archer to do the job. However, if they sent an archer to do what a warrior could not, then Vargum would take comfort in that fact. But the charge continued, and Vargum could only assume that there was a measure of pride stopping them from falling back on the easy route. Another wave descended, and with a frightening roar, Vargum lifted his glaive above him before bringing it down with all of his strength, cleaving the Centaur's skull down the center. But the next attacker was already upon him. With a sword in one hand, he struck the glaive from Vargum's hands, and with a club in the other, the enemy went to strike. But Vargum was too fast, spinning under the blow, pulling out one of his khopesh and slicing all the way up the Centaur's abdomen, his inside slopping out onto the sand. But now Vargum was open. A spear tip found his left shoulder, biting into flesh and muscle, striking bone. A sharp roar of pain pierced the air, and the force of the blow put him onto his knee. An eye for an eye, Vargum removed the hand that held the spear, with it falling free, leaving an open gash in his shoulder. He wouldn't last much longer with such a wound, yet a smile broadened across his grizzled face. 15 lives had been claimed, all from a single fighter, and if the next life claimed was his, he would consider that its own victory. But Vargum's light had not yet faded, and he still had one good arm. Still he was too fast, still he was too strong, still he was too fierce, and 20 corpses lay in his wake before another blade slashed his leg, and he was forced once again to his knee. But his attacker still could not finish the job, and paid for his failure with his own leg, sending him crashing into the sand before losing his head to Vargum's blade. With only one good arm and one good leg, Vargum knew his end was close. He looked to where the black of the night had masked the enemy, only for the light of 1,000 torches to brightly illuminate the full force of the Centaur army. Thousands stood, ominously in the torchlight, ready to attack at a moment's notice. Vargum prepared himself for his final stand, muttering a prayer to the gods, thanking them for a glorious end. The Centaur captains called out, and the company began the move. But a sound caught Vargum's attention. The Leonian war drums boomed behind him as the gate opened, with all that remained of their forces filing out, with Gesius at the head. Gesius stood proudly at Vargum's side, raising his own glaive into the air.
He is Vargum, warlord of Nel Faldur. On our honor, we will defend him to our dying breaths.
Gesius bellowed, prompting a chorus of roars like the roll of thunder cascading into the night. Vargum looked to his captain with a choked-up admiration and gratitude before turning his attention to the encroaching army, lending his own roars to all who had come to his aid. Less than 2,000 now stood along the riverbank, ready for their final battle, vastly outnumbered, yet stood as though the odds were in their favor. The clash was as water on rock, and sounded like a storm of steel. Inspired by their warlord, the Leonians fought more fiercely than they ever had before, and for every one of theirs that fell, they visited back fourfold. Vargum pushed through the pain, spurred on by his people, but he still knew it would not be enough. Vargum's forces were ferocious in their efforts, yet the Centaur army kept coming. A seemingly endless supply of troops continued to emerge from the darkness. But another sound was heard overhead, which almost stopped the battle dead. It was a roar more terrifying than 10,000 Leonians. The battlefield lit up as it was bathed in flames. The shrieks of the Centaur army was blood-curdling. Another roar, another torrent of fire, as dozens more fell to its fury. Centaur archers shot wildly into the night sky, but to no avail. But Vargum saw it, as it swooped in for another assault. A dragon. But not just any dragon, for as Vargum watched it circling the battle, he noticed the glint of armor across the beast's hide. A silent joy swelled in his chest, and he breathed a sigh of relief, for only one dragon in Azura wore armor. It was Verlaine, raised and tamed by Gavresh, the Aiduard lord of the Blood Dragon House. Morale was high, and Leonian roars of cheer filled the air as Verlaine swooped again, spreading her inferno through the Centaur ranks, and Vargum knew that victory was nigh. Come the morning, the fighting had stopped, and no living Centaur remained on the field of battle. Amongst the dust and the ash, it could not be known just how many had fallen and how many had fled, but victory had been achieved, and that's all that mattered. The Leonians cheered and praised Lord Gavresh and his magnificent beast. But Vargum was not forgotten, for all his braids and titles were reinstated, and his heroic deed would be immortalized in song and art. Over the subsequent days, the rest of the Aiduard reinforcements arrived, relieving the Leonians of their hard-fought burden. In the south, the Sandcoat tribe, along with their allies, managed to push the Centaurs back into a full-scale retreat, and with Lord Gavresh's aid, the Snowcoats to the north were finally able to find victory. The Leonian tribelands of Escherine were finally safe, and Vargum could take care of one final thread. It wasn't long before word had spread about the war chief's abandonment of his people, and it was Vargum himself who challenged his right to rule. The war chief was old and had grown complacent in his duty, now weak and soft. Knowing he would have to take on Vargum in one-on-one combat, he elected to face exile rather than death. And so, after a long war of doubt and hopelessness, Vargum was proclaimed war chief of Escherine, hero of the Sanguine Isle, and the leader of the Leonian tribes, where he would rule fiercely for years to come.